Hi guys, welcome to Indicast. And today Raj and I decided that after 21 hours of negotiation between the Americans and the Iranians in Islamabad, Pakistan, it was high time that we covered the results of those negotiations. The results were essentially nada, nothing. Anyway, coming back to Raj, what do you think happened?
Dude, I think that Pakistanis displayed some ambition
Yeah.
with respect to allowing and encouraging the two parties to come on a negotiating table. But I think ambition is all the Pakistanis had to offer.
Yes,
And there was
essentially.
nothing concrete that could come out of it. There's 28, 21 hours of talks, no deal coming out of it. The Americans sent a 15-point proposal, I think. The Iranians returned about 10 points of their own proposals.
Yes.
And neither of those materialized to anything. And I think what we have presently is a very fragile end of hostilities, or at least hostilities have stopped, but it's very fragile. And we have blockades and counter blockades, threats coming in from the US president that the US Navy is going to go and block the Strait of Hormuz
This
now.
is just bizarre. Like your
Yeah.
whole point was to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz
Hmm.
is again opened up.
Hmm.
Now you blocking it again,
Hmm.
it does not make any sense. This
Hmm.
just goes to show that nothing happened in Islamabad,
Yeah.
and this is where my message to my dear friends across the border is that stop being so arrogant and stop being so supercilious. It is very important that you understand that your relevance in this particular uh, conference was just a particular venue which was suitable for both the parties. Other than that, you have absolutely no role to play.
No,
And
I
if there
mean,
was
okay.
something, it was
Yeah.
some. If there was something, we could have gotten a result. The fact of the matter is that Iranians still walked out. Just goes to show that Pakistan is essentially just treated as another vassal state of the Americans or vassal state. I
See,
don't know.
let's just look at it like
Yeah.
this. I don't want to make this discussion an
Mm,
anti-Pakistan rant.
of course.
I just think that they have a post-box problem. You know that problems arise when
Yeah.
you are making essentially a sort of US dependent state like the Pakistanis host such talks. So there's partly there's a trust deficit. The Iranians did name Asim Munir in their admission that there was going to be a ceasefire. So I think they had ambitions to sort of secede or reduce the violence.
But
I think that
my point is with
yeah.
respect to Pakistani intellectuals and the braggadocio that they indulged in, that well, Indians are watching IPL, we are ensuring global peace. But where is the global peace? And I think there's nothing really concrete that came out of the
See,
Islamabad talks.
I think unfortunately what Islamabad also has probably realized by now is that it's not a major player in the conflict.
It is not.
See, after all, the conflict ends from all the parties that have a vote. Most people around the world have had their questions about the credibility of this unlikely sort of mediator or power broker or whatever. But the issue with the Pakistanis has been that they are not a strong vote holder when it comes to ending conflict in West Asia. This conflict ends from three capital cities, and none of them are Islamabad.
And
This ends from Tehran, this
Yeah.
ends from Tel Aviv, and this ends from Washington,
Washington.
DC.
And while the talks were happening, the Israelis were still indulging in one of the most brazen attacks against Lebanese people. They had given out orders that people cannot move back to their villages until unless the Israelis decide to do so. They've already started razing down villages. So I don't think the main agenda that the Iranians went into talks
Yeah.
for, like ending the conflict in Lebanon as well,
Yeah.
was even discussed.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people were saying that Lebanon was out of question, out of reach.
Yeah,
We were not even talking
yeah.
about Lebanon here.
I think the Pakistanis also made some intentional omissions from the agenda of
Yes.
the ceasefire plan.
Yeah.
So a lot of the conversation was happening ex post. That, oh well, is Lebanon included or not? And then JD Vance comes and says that, oh, we didn't really include Lebanon in the ceasefire agreement. So the moment the sort of tweets went out from Pakistan saying that we have prevented this great situation from escalating, that is the same, like within hours you have the Israelis bombing the Lebanese, and then that leads to a huge humanitarian loss.
Like,
So many
I'm not
civilian-
laughing at the humanitarian
Yeah.
loss. I'm just laughing at
the situation,
braggadocio,
yeah,
exactly,
the
situation.
loss,
Yeah.
the loss and the erosion of
Yeah.
any kind of international order, right?
Exactly.
Because the moment Lebanon is struck, most of the people who die, most of the humanitarian toll goes towards the civilian deaths, right? And then that becomes a very unfortunate facet of this failing and race to the bottom that we have going on in West Asia. I think the Israelis and the Iranians are both very spoiler capable actors. Like, they have very high appetite for violence now. The Israelis have gone and sabotaged talks, deals, negotiations many times. The Iranians too now have a high appetite for military action. They've disrupted the global supply of goods from the Strait of Hormuz. They have many times disrupted economic infrastructure across West Asia. So I think one thing that has escalated into a situation where the entire language is non-mediatory. Everything is going towards an escalatory ladder. Even though the violence might have reduced a little bit, it's a very fragile ceasefire right now. I don't know how long it will hold.
As of
I think the Israelis are somebody who will not be happy with complete degradation of the Iranians. Their Listen, the Israelis' appetite for any Iranian military capability is zero or negative. So as long as you have a surviving Iranian state that anybody is talking to, the Israelis will always hate that. So I think the evidence has also shown that they will go out of their way to strike and sabotage any Iranian infrastructure, as even if somebody's talking to them, even if their principal ally like the United States is talking to them. To I think the United States' great resentment and irritation, sometimes Israelis have gone and struck Iran when the Americans have given them a yellow light at best. So I think Israel is a spoiler capable actor. I'm not giving Iranians a clean sheet. They have disrupted the trade routes along West Asia a lot. So whether or not Islamabad ever had the vote to end this conflict is something that requires deep introspection on their part. I don't think they ever did.
For a second, I thought that if Islamabad is successful in getting peace, which I was very optimistic about the Islamabad talks. And in fact, in our last episode, I also talked about how Pakistan has become more fraternal towards the Iranians, ignoring the Shia-Sunni divide. Now, coming back to my point, I was thought that if these talks become successful, I thought that this would be a great opportunity for Indians and Pakistanis to start talking again, start opening their diplomatic channels to a level where we had achieved with Pervez Musharraf. Again, a lot of people and a lot of hardliners in India would disagree with me. They will say, "Nahi, there should be no talks. We should constantly be constantly be against the Pakistanis." And I understand where they're coming from, but I genuinely feel that it is better that we also establish a more stable relationship with the Pakistanis, specifically along the LOC, and the violence stops. I mean, of course, it is reduced significantly after Op Sandur. It has
and
reduced
I think diplomatic channels also
Yes.
help. For whatever credit that may be due, the Pakistanis were at war with the TTP along
They're still at war.
along
That
along the
hasn't-
Durand line. West Asia is our extended neighborhood. Pakistan and Iran share a border, and the conflict after Operation Epic Fury hit our coast as well, where an Iranian frigate sank. So
Yes.
the fact that it hasn't spilled over
Exactly.
into South Asia is it's sort of credit to our own agencies
And credit to the neighbors as well.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think if there's some kind of
Yeah.
diplomatic channels that have been ongoing, they've been able to weather this
Weather the
storm. And I think that's to a degree, I feel like hilariously, India and Pakistan have both been in a very complicated situation ever since this conflict
Yes.
started. So the Saudis and the Pakistanis, ever since last year, have a mutual defense agreement of
Yes.
sorts. So Pakistan has that relationship to keep with the Gulf Arab states. The Gulf Arab states, in turn, have a relationship now with the Israelis. But the Pakistanis are a Muslim state, so on paper they have to hate the Israelis,
Yeah.
and you don't want to isolate the only Muslim power in the world, which is Iran, which is at war with the Israelis too much. So Pakistan also has to do this balancing act where they are talking to the Saudis. They're saying that we have a mutual defense agreement with the Saudis, but you also don't want to vilify the Iranians too much, because Iranians have shown some leadership in the Islamic world by sort of
Supporting Hamas.
bombing occupied Palestine, as they call it, bombing Tel Aviv,
In which they ended
Yeah.
up killing a bunch of Palestinians.
Yeah.
That's just so tragic.
So I think West Asian politics, the political Islam, the Pakistani perspective in all of this is a complicated situation that needs a lot of watching. I think the Pakistanis are very good strategic partners of the UAE, of the Saudis and the other Gulf Arab states. So they have always allowed themselves to be used as a asset, and they have been able to rent their assets to the West Asian Gulf Arab countries a lot in the past. So there is a natural military relationship also that exists between the Pakistanis and the Gulf Arab
Funnily,
states.
during the time of the Shah of Iran, this type of military relationship existed between the Pakistanis and the Iranis as well.
Yeah.
Till 70s, the Shah of Iran was openly supporting the Pakistanis in most of their operations.
Yeah.
Hilariously, the Islamic regime has been more pro-India than the Shah. So
Yeah.
how do you explain this to someone who's mostly operating in this, like, this monochromatic type of existence
Yeah,
where
the
Hindus
silofication.
versus Muslims, and like,
Yeah.
so this is where it gets a little bit. See, that's where geopolitics becomes a little more complicated, because then you're not just looking at one identity, you're looking at multiple layers of identity, and it depends on what identity you wanna relate with your particular neighbor or your particular adversary, so
Yeah.
that it suits your wider goals internationally.
Yeah, listen, man, like one of the simple things that I want to add to this is that, in principle, I think in the West Asian region, one of the closest trustworthy allies that India probably has right now is the Taliban, which I find hilarious. And we've also, in a much less extreme way, we've also seen much better relationships with the Gulf in the Modi government.
Yeah,
And we all know what the dominant religion is in the Gulf Arab states.
exactly,
So I think that if you make these binaries and try to
exactly.
if you try to understand West Asia through these binaries,
Yeah.
you're not going to do yourself a favor.
Mm.
We understand the tussle that exists between the Saudis and the Iranians for the leadership in the Muslim world. That documentary I was telling you about, Bitter Rivals in Frontline by PBS, it had a very high-ranking Saudi official who came on the screen and said that, Iranians have always looked at us like the Shah, the Gulf monarchies. They've always claimed that they were a lot like the Shah of Iran, that they don't deserve to be in power. They deserve to be ousted by a more radical sort of Islamic revolution. And that's something that has always driven anxiety in the Gulf Arab states, which is part of the reason why I think Gulf Arab states and the Israelis assist each other in the background. So one of the things that I feel now that has revealed itself in West Asia is that this fissure is only going to strengthen. And for a lot of Sunni Arabs, the Iranians, their way of practice, and it's almost a little heretical. And the revolutionary anxiety that the Iranians try to export through, whether it's from their proxies like the Yemeni Houthis or the Hezbollah against Israel, or Yemeni Houthis against the Saudis, and Hamas again against the Israelis. There's this degree of irritation at the Gulf Arab states, which is, I think, I'll conclude by saying that it's part of the reason why Mohammed bin Salman has been one of the people who has allegedly, I'm not in a position to confirm this, but allegedly he's been one of the people who's been repeatedly urging Trump to strike Iran. So he's been one of the more hawkish people. And it's no coincidence that Mohammed bin Salman started his career as the defense minister of Saudi Arabia, where his first task was to fight the Houthi
Houthis
rebels
in
who were
Yemen.
backed by Iran. Jai, back to
Absolutely.
you. Sorry for the
No,
long.
no, yes, I totally agree. And funnily enough, I think every party in this particular conflict has its own version that they're presenting its people and its populations to show complete victory.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is doing it on his own, on his own way through different Truth Social posts, and the Iranians are also doing it. Like, as I mentioned, the 10-point plan that they had given the Americans, there was an English version and there was a Farsi version. So the Farsi version actually talked about having enriched uranium and going ahead with that. And I think this became a major point of contention this time, where the Iranians did not back down on, like, their enriched uranium assets, and that is what really really alarmed the Americans. The thing is that if they wouldn't have struck the Iranians twice, I'm talking about the 12-day war as well.
Yeah.
You could have had the deal where the Iranians could have, given that enriched uranium to a third party,
Yeah.
where I've heard it was going to be the Russians,
Yeah.
and you could have had a non-nuclear Iran very easily. But
Yeah.
because of these two conflicts, these two short wars, and I hope this war ends, and I hope I'm proven wrong with respect to the Islamabad talks, you could have easily achieved a non-nuclear Iran had you not started two wars. Now that you've started two wars, you have got a more hawkish Iran. You've got a more radicalized, quote unquote, Ayatollah,
Yeah.
whose dad you killed, whose
Yeah.
half of the family you blew up in the airstrike. So
Yeah.
now you have to deal with an Iran which is not letting go of its enriched uranium assets.
Yeah.
So where does that leave you? It leaves you at a position where you again go back to the first clause that was already agreed upon in the 2015 deal.
Yeah.
So what does this show? I think there has been no cohesive action on the front of the Americans, where they just did everything on the basis of their impulse.
Yeah.
And there were no geopolitical goals also. It was just something that they wanted to do and they did it whether it was to diverge attention from the Epstein files or whether it was for the Israeli demands. I cannot say, but it wasn't planned out at all.
I have something
And
to say about that.
and also the fact that so many important American military leaders, generals, they were like being fired left, right, and center.
Joe Kent resigned.
Exactly. So it just put you in a position where you're basically dealing with a bunch of yes men, and I say this a lot of times, who just make you listen to what you want to hear, and it doesn't really help in the wider frame of things.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have a lot of regard and a lot of respect for the foreign policy intellectuals of the US from the Democrat era. I listen a lot to people like Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan. Today I was watching a podcast by Jake Sullivan, which is called The Long Game. The ex-US National Security Advisor now hosts a podcast, so you can just listen to him directly. It's called The Long Game. And him and his co-host, who was also in the US government at some point, they were both talking about how the injured and sort of more hawkish Iran is a more dangerous and strengthened Iran that the Americans have left today.
Yes.
So, because you struck Iranians with no clear objectives, the Omanis had naturally wrapped up a very productive round of meetings with the Iranians. There was almost something which could resemble, I don't want to say lasting peace, but some kind of cooperation around the nuclear anxiety could have been achieved. And I feel like the Tel Aviv pressure on Washington with respect to Iran got in the way, and eventually the US was left with no choice but to strike Iran. This is growingly becoming the more popular position across even US foreign policy think tank circles, that people have begun to realize that, hey man, it's probably Tel Aviv which is setting our West Asia policy and not the US itself. And the evidence, the writings on the wall. So, one thing that's happened lately is that these strikes have just strengthened Iran a little bit more. And I'm not saying that they are the principal military power in West Asia. But to be powerful, they don't have to be the main military power. They just have to be a good disruptor. And they've proven to be excellent at that. The entire Strait of Hormuz can be jammed just with their disruptive capabilities. And those capabilities aren't going anywhere.
They just require
Yeah.
old speedboats with their ballistic missiles.
Yeah, I mean, speedboats, Shahed drones, even some smaller patrolling vessels with the IRGC commandos who are ready to board a
Exactly.
shipping vessel, and that can drive a lot of anxiety across the trade infrastructure around the world. So the Iranians are arguably stronger at the end of this war. They're injured, they are still functioning, and
घायल हूँ लेकिन घातक हूँ.
and they have, yeah, precisely, they have now all the more reason to not cooperate with the US and the Israelis, because the last two times they were talking, they were struck both times. So what evidence do they have to support a third round of negotiations? So I think that's going to be a challenge that the Americans will face, whether or not the next administration in the US, Democrat, Republican, their foreign policy architecture will need more able negotiators to come out of this. I think I just want to say that Pete Hegseth, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, these folks aren't West Asia experts. These guys aren't the smartest minds in about West Asia. I think they may be good negotiators. I don't want to discredit any human being, but this is my principal disagreement with the Republican sort of administration, is that all the Democrat guys I was talking about, the Blinkens and the Jake Sullivans of the world, they actually knew what they were talking about. There's in principle there's a mismatch over there, and the Iranians, because it's a sort of their majlis and their ayatollahs run the show there, so their foreign policy architecture has largely been the same. So their negotiators don't change. But the American negotiators will keep changing based on what kind of administration is in Washington. And I feel like that's been a factor on how easily the Americans were able to give in to the request of Tel Aviv. Because if you believe a lot of ex-CIA folks, most of them believe that it's a very regular demand of the Israelis to come to the Americans and say, you've got to strike the Iranians for us. So it happens fairly often. And I think it was just Trump's administration that gave way to it. Jay, back to you.
Yeah, essentially a new type of deterrence architecture has been created where Iran essentially knows that it can wage a full asymmetric war against the Americans, where it has like an economic upper hand just by disrupting the operations that go along the Strait of Hormuz. And as you mentioned clearly that, as I had also mentioned earlier, that there has been no clarity with respect to what objectives there exactly are, and it's essentially Americans driving their West Asia policy under the pressure of the Israelis. So, where does this leave the world? It leaves the world with a huge question that when do things actually normalize in West Asia so that things become normal again? Specifically with respect to the disruption that has been caused to LPG, CNG, petroleum, then the crude prices, and then of course one of the most important things which people are not discussing enough is fertilizers. And if fertilizers are not being given to agrarian economies, specifically like ours, specifically that of Pakistan, it can lead to massive. It can lead to a huge catastrophe. And if there is no food, how do you sustain an economy or sustain a population? And that is obviously a very very far-fetched assumption that I'm going towards, but it has the potential
Yeah.
of reaching that.
Yeah. If you're Jay talking about how the world is going to be after this conflict, I have 3-4 points to this, and I'll probably let this be my concluding statement also. Uh, Iran was struck twice during negotiations. So you've sent that signal to a lot of other countries also that international order has fractured to the extent that negotiations also don't mean much. So you've made the world generally a little bit more of a hostile place.
100%.
After the lifting of Nicolas Maduro in January, and the strikes on Iran, and the worsening crisis in West Asia, whether it was military strikes by the Iranians on Saudi, UAE, etc. One thing that has been ascertained beyond reasonable doubt is that more military expenditure will be the radical next outcome.
And a lot of countries would try to go nuclear.
Yeah, because most countries now feel like being nuclear is the only hedge against this insecure world.
Yeah.
So, as international orders rupture, people will want to strengthen their domestic military capabilities a little bit more. So, I feel like this will start resembling a weapons race to the bottom again, where we're all trying to build more stockpiles, more ballistic missiles. Future conflicts will see maybe a little bit more of ballistic missile targeting of capital cities also.
100%.
So I think these are times which are going to be uncertain. It's going to be
More
geopolitically
emphasis on
risky.
BVR, more emphasis on beyond visual range.
Absolutely, total emphasis on
Yeah.
beyond visual range, and the geopolitical risks and their impacts on the economy will be a driver of however we are to make money in the future and however we are to engage with society.
Essentially,
Tell me.
what this conflict has triggered is not World War III. It has triggered Cold War 2.0,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
You know what? I feel I have a term for this. And you know how a psychiatrist diagnose you with generalized anxiety disorder whenever you have a lot of anxiety about running around, your life, your career. So they have a term called generalized anxiety disorder. Uh, I have a term for this which I have coined as globalized anxiety disorder, where the globalization and international order has fractured to a point where it has caused people's personal anxieties to rise, your expenses to rise, your gas prices, your electricity bills, your employment situation gets affected, and all of that because most of the international institutions are eroding. Conflict resolution doesn't exist, and most of the countries that go to war somehow or the other also control critical energy choke points. So we live in times of globalized anxiety disorder.
100%. Anyway, my concluding thoughts is that this is such a, so I don't know, man. Like calling it a quote unquote conventional war is something that I would avoid using, because this is the most unconventional form of warfare I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, it's tweets and truth social posts which are affecting the swing of the market.
Yeah.
So, like, the market is about to collapse, and suddenly Donald Trump comes in and he says that, you know what, we've achieved all the goals that we wanted to, and the ceasefire is coming as soon as possible, and suddenly the markets go up again. So, even with respect to how markets operate and what the predictive nature of the markets was pre 20th February 2026,
Yeah.
has also changed completely, because this war has become such a disruptor that what the president of the United States is thinking is going to manipulate the markets. And also, last thing that I'm going to say is that after this war, another thing and a very very harsh truth that I've woken up to is that the United States of America, in essentiality, controls most of the economic power of the quote unquote free world.
Yeah.
There is no denying that.
Yeah.
It's because of its actions that the whole world either comes to a standstill or it suffers with respect to the economic consequences
Yeah.
of that.
Purely by being a hard power
Hard
state.
power access.
Our
And
F-35s and
exactly.
our USS Abraham Lincolns and Gerald
Exactly.
Fords can go wherever in the world.
Yes.
They can bomb you back to the Stone Ages.
Yes.
These are words that even the US president is saying
Misuse.
now,
Any
that a whole civilization is going to die. So there's been a major erosion of due regard to international order and an escalation in their display of their military
100%.
capabilities. Both of these things are worrying.
Yes.
And I think, like Shekhar Gupta said in a video that I was watching around Op Sindoor, he said something like, put your seatbelts on. So, this is from an international order perspective.
Yeah.
You got to put our seatbelts on. Jay, you were saying
Yeah.
something.
Anyway, I think those were my concluding thoughts. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And,
Please like, share, subscribe. Jay and I have also been writing on Substack a little bit lately.
Yes, we'll
so we'll
attach
attach our Substack links to this.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.